My name is Jacob Blumenfeld. I'm a fellow at the Center for Social Critique at Humboldt University, Berlin, and I'm co-leading a project there on socialization of land and energy, and thinking about how to transform economic ownership or ownership structures. I came into the work of Alex Demirović, and I met Alex discussing economic democracy, which is one of his research fields. We got to talking about councilism, Karl Korsch, and slowly I realized he has a great background also in Frankfurt School critical theory. I was happy to discover. Alex Demirović is a senior fellow at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung and a permanent fellow at the Center for Social Critique. He is a uphold professor for political science and political sociology at the Goethe-Universität Frankfurt am Main. His research focuses on Marxist state theory, economic democracy, and critical theory. He's the host of a fantastic critical theory podcast called TLDR, Too Long Didn't Read, and which, there's great episodes there on Marcuse, Karl Korsch, Sonreta, Lukács, kind of a whole gallery of critical theory figures. Since this is an English language discussion with Alex, it's probably good for you to practice your German by listening to this podcast, all you guests out there. Yeah. So the plan for this discussion, or welcome Alex, first of all.
Yeah, thank you.
The plan for this discussion is to talk for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then open it up for questions. I hope you save your questions until we're done. And then when we're ready, you can just put them in the chat. And then Clara, who's here also, will help kind of filter and curate those questions. Now, the occasion for this conversation is two books, basically. One is the Nonconformist Intellectual, Der Nonconformist Intellektuelle. This is the first edition from 1999, a classic now, which was
the second one.
which was recently republished by Mandelbaum Press, and it's going to be translated. It is translated in English by Joel Rashbash, and it'll be published in the Historical Materialism series, perhaps later this year or early next year. There's also a second book that Alex is working on, close to finishing, which is more of a memoir. Wenn man nichts will, erkennt man nichts, which means if you don't want it, you don't get it. If you don't want it, something like that. If you don't want it, you'll get it. So let's get into the conversation. Let me start with the first paragraph from this book. Alex begins his book like this. While the history of political ideas concentrates on the classical canon of politico-philosophical texts and the sociology of science on the empirical process of the generation of scientific knowledge, the empirical practice of theory can also be determined and analyzed as a political one. Reason and truth are not a subject reserved for philosophy alone, but represent political praxis in a specific sense. This calls for a social theoretical expansion of the subject matter of political theory and the history of ideas. So our conversation will focus on this, quote, empirical practice of theory, right? Specifically the post-war institutional and intellectual work of Adorno and Horkheimer at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt in the 1950s and 60s. That is after the war, when they returned from the US exile to a whole new Germany, right? And they had the chance to reshape the educational curriculum for the youth of former Nazis, right? To teach philosophy in a new way as a political project. We'll hopefully kind of in this conversation go through that and get up to the student movement and beyond to reflect on the role of critical theory today. Now, this talk is called The Politics of Critical Theory, but it's politics in a very specific sense. It's not the politics in terms of their positions on different issues that arise in the day, but the politics of producing theory, right? So the institutional politics, the intellectual politics of being a critical intellectual in public. Now, before we get to the Frankfurters themselves, let's just start with you, Alex. How did you come to critical theory, especially the Frankfurt School critical theory, in the first place?
Okay, thank you, Jacob, for making this event possible. That's really great, to have this conversation in public. And yes, how it came. I mean, it was the student movement, yeah, and it also had an impact on us as younger college students at that time. And we had this movement, a protest movement against the closure of universities, the introduction of fees, yeah, in the university. This was an idea of conservative technocrats to close universities or to limit the possibility to become a student. And yeah, and around these protests, there have been so many working groups founded. And then, yeah, there are, of course, groups discussing Marcuse and Marx and Adorno and so on, and the problems of inequality and education. And so I came into contact with critical theory, and I have also to say that one of the most important teachers in my college, he was a former disciple of Adorno, so he knew some of these theoretical debates, and though he was the first I came in contact with critical theory and Walter Benjamin and so there was a kind of an atmosphere. Yeah, it was not so very concrete. The texts had been so difficult to read, to understand, but it was a challenge to do it. I mean, this was, I think, very important. And then, yeah, then I made the decision to go to Frankfurt, either West Berlin or to Frankfurt, and so.
What year was this, or what years are you talking about here?
So it was the late 60s, yeah. So the student movement was more or less over. And then the early 70s. So I entered into the university in autumn 71. At that time, Adorno was already dead. Yeah, and Habermas just left the Frankfurt University. Many of the student representatives of the movement, yeah, they had left the university, or one who was really famous in Frankfurt and for the left debates in West Germany, Hans-Jürgen Krahl, he died a year before. Yeah, so, and then people, yeah, were a little bit disoriented. Many of these people, they tended to become member of communist organizations, parties. This was called a proletarian turn. And for me, coming from a working class family, that was not so bad, because it gave me the feeling of proud, yeah, because I mean, everybody had a bad consciousness about the idea of not coming from a working class background, yeah. But for me, it was, but the communist parties were very rigid. Some of them very Stalinist, yeah. They admired Stalin, Enver Hoxha, and many crazy things, So I was not interested in that, but yeah, it was more or less then critical theory. And then after a while, I figured out that there are very interesting debates going on in France and in the French Marxism, post-structuralist discussions, yeah, on semiology and Althusser's suggestion to read Marx. So in Frankfurt at that time, it was a discussion about a new reconstruction of Marx. But what they did was to read only the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, only the problem of value form, exchange of commodities, and fetish. Yeah. So, and I found it too small, the range of problems. It had nothing to say about accumulation, exploitation, yeah, and the whole process, the process of capitalist hold. So I was interested in that, yeah.
Okay.
And so I my interest turned to these debates, So it was a French and also an Anglo-Saxon debate, on the strategies of accumulation and understanding what the process of capitalist reproduction, in the whole is driven by and organized and so on.
Now, you got there after Kroll died, after Adorno passed, and Horkheimer was gone. But if I remember, I mean, Marcuse was still around.
Yeah.
And he was still coming to, I mean, he was teaching in California at this time, but he was still coming to Berlin and Frankfurt. Did he have a role on your development at all?
He played a role for me as a college student. I read some of his articles and books, so, and then also in as a student. Because it was more accessible than Adorno's books, but there haven't been so much books by Adorno at that time. And for me, Marcuse, because he seemed to be, and in fact, in a way, he was more radical than Adorno, more familiar with the movement. So closer to the debates we had at that time in the movement. And but I was not a student. He came for teach-ins, so he spoke as one of the speakers on a solidarity campaign for Angela Davis, when she was imprisoned, and so it was like this, So it was 2 or 3 times, and of course some of my colleagues, they were closer to the American context, to Marcuse, to his girlfriend at that time, or later his wife. And so there was some how to say, intertwined relations, some contexts in which I figured out what the debates are about, and then Marcuse at that time began to discuss problems of ecology, and this became very, very important. The relation of Marxist debate, late capitalism, ecology, and also feminism. So he took up these issues from the social movement debates and then translated it into terms of critical theory. And this was really a big incentive. It was a challenge to follow this way. I mean, although at the same time there have been relevant feminist debates, and we had these debates. I mean, like everywhere, the debates on a separation of gender and sexes. I mean, should be their political organizations only for women, and then what would happen to the whole of the left and social movement developments. And Marcuse, he was in a way helpful, to think on this and to reflect on all these problems.
Now, I mean, it's quite different to encounter Adorno and Horkheimer in a seminar room than to encounter them kind of in the midst of a left-wing student movement. So in the English-speaking world, many people see the Frankfurt School as, apolitical academics who retreated to abstract theory and don't really have anything to say to the world, and they're not political per se. Now, I think your book challenges this basic idea that they were somehow separate from public practice, right? So can you explain, just to go back a bit, can you explain a bit Horkheimer and Adorno's role in Germany when they returned from exile, right? So what were their working conditions? What did they seek to do in the university? How did they work as public intellectuals? Like, what was the atmosphere when they returned?
Sure, I can do that. You have to interrupt me because that's a long story, and I mean, I wrote these 1,000 pages on this subject, right? And it was the way how I approached it, and why I did it was at that time in the 80s, and yeah, it was basically in the 80s and early 90s, there was a debate on the resignative and character of the first generation of critical theory. You know, so the suggestion was brought forward by Rolf Wiggershaus and others, Helmut Dubil and Habermas, to say that critical theory has exhausted. They came back, they adapted to the German situation, so they shared the restorative atmosphere. They contributed to this kind of conservatism in the West German society. That is important to say, that it was a divided country. It's West Germany, so it's not the whole of Germany at that time. And for me, it was interesting to see that when you read one of these important articles, yeah, Horkheimer wrote in the 30s on traditional and critical theory, Horkheimer had a clear idea to say that what is so important for us is to give critical theory, and in his eyes, critical theory was a term not under censorship. It was an idea to change the knowledge form of what was traditionally meant by Marxism, but it was not a party-oriented Marxism. It was not a dogmatic form of Marxism. It was a new form of knowledge, you know, he was thinking about. And his idea was to say that it is necessary to recruit younger people and to give critical theory, the way how critical theory is approaching the world, a continuity. So that means, yeah, and for them it was really a tragic and serious experience that with the Nazi regime in 1933, everything was destroyed in a few weeks and months. The destruction of newspapers, of journals, of publishing houses, the way how the relation between intellectuals and parties have been organized at that time. So everything was destroyed, and more than 100,000 left people were forced to go to the concentration camps, yeah, the Social Democrats, people from the trade unions, communists, and so on. Or they had to leave the country to flee, yeah, from Germany, and because they were threatened by death, by torture, and so on. And for Horkheimer, it was so important to say that this is a new historical period, yeah, the left is confronted with, and it's necessary to establish a circle of people who trust to each other and who are committed to truth and reason. So the basic idea, in my eyes, was to bring people together. And what he says in this article on critical theory, that what brings us together is the commitment to reason. Yeah, this is the knowledge, yeah, erkenntnis. So there is an epistemological reason to coming together. And so the idea of educating people in this tradition, and that is always a tradition of Hegel, Marx, Freud, yeah, more or less, and political economy. And this idea of educating people in this lens was programmatic in the Institute of Social Research already in the late 30s in the US. And then when the invitation came from the Frankfurt University to go back to Frankfurt, then they were skeptical about it, how so many other immigrants, should they do it or not? So they had not a consensus at that time. Yeah, Horkheimer was skeptical. Adorno, he was really in favor to go back to Germany, and that means West Germany, because his idea was there is a chance to teach, to speak in German, to write in German, to come in contact with a German audience, a public debates in the tradition. And so when he came back to Frankfurt, then he was a professor for music sociology. So it was a ridiculous minor role he played at that time in the early 50s. And they expected to have many Nazi students among the students. Yeah, they had to teach. But then the experience, and this is what Adorno wrote to Horkheimer, please come as soon as possible to Germany, because it's really exciting to get to know all these young students who are so interested in discussing social theory, Kant, Hegel, Marx, and so on. So he was really enthusiastic about it and not very frightened by Nazis or so. So his idea, I mean, was, so he had to go back to the US for 1 year in 52, 53, and he really hated it to go back to Los Angeles. And he said, I prefer to be killed by Nazis in Germany than ever going back to the US. Yeah. So for him, it was clear he never would go back. So for him, it was clear he was already, and he would like to continue with that, to be a teacher in the university, and combining philosophy. That is an important issue, combining philosophy and sociology. For them, it was clear that philosophy shouldn't be taught in terms of traditional German philosophy. That means philosophy of the spirit, philosophy in terms of hermeneutics. Yeah, so, but philosophy seen in also as a way to come in contact with the material, with society, with empirical data. So for them, it was clear that philosophy students should also have a knowledge on what's going on in the society. So not the way that they only study the books of Hegel and Kant and Aristotle and so on, but also have a clear sense and an idea of what's going on in capitalist societies. And of course, it was not, how to say, it was not the concrete German society. It was an idea of how capitalism is organized, how the value form, is determining our everyday life, the way how we see the world, So this was, and so they had these wonderful and sometimes crazy debates on false consciousness, what is ideology, necessary false consciousness, all these kind of discussions that influenced generations of younger students than in the years of the 50s and 60s and even in the 70s and 80s. There was a long lasting debate on these issues. What is false consciousness? Is it plausible to speak on false consciousness? So they had all these debates in the seminars. So now this is published in German. You can read all this, and it's really wonderful because you get a very good sense of how Adorno discussed these problems much more in these internal debates with his students than in his public writings. So for me, for that reason, I argue, so for me, it was, my impression was that there is some, how to say, an external and an internal perspective of criticism. For the students, it was much more clearer than for the general public that Adorno refers very often to former Marxist debates, so that means Lukács and Korsch and so on. So as far as Adorno knew these things, I think many of the debates he himself didn't didn't know so well. But okay, so and then of course to come to this point, the role. I mean, this is at that time one has to be aware of the fact that people didn't know so much about Adorno and Horkheimer. You know, they were not very known. Yeah, when they came back in the early 50s, one of the well-known philosophers, Max Benzer, at that time, in a review article on the dialectics of enlightenment, he wrote, "Why the hell they coming back from California? They should stay there and do all these stupid things, Hegel and Marx. Nobody is interested in these things. They are over. It's old-fashioned. No one needs these old problems, you know?" So this was a way how people spoke about it, you know, but so I think, yeah, they were not very well known. But Horkheimer at that time, he was elected as a president of the Frankfurt University, what was a huge honor, of course. And he was, at that time, he was responsible for as a president, he had to make the decision to build a student house, a house where students can organize their political debates, yeah, a self-administered what is the English word? Autogestion, selbstverwaltet, you know, so they
self-managed.
Yeah, self-managed, and student house with a hall, with an own cinema and a cafe and kindergarten and so on and so on. Yeah, so and yeah, so that was one thing he did as a president. Yeah, and he had a clear idea that students need spaces, free spaces, for exercising democracy, having their own discussions, yeah, the independent own discussions. And this is so what I did in the book is I compared Horkheimer's public speeches, the way how his discourses worked, and in difference to other presidents of West German universities. And many of those people, yeah, with a former Nazi background, they referred to God, the lovely nature. And when you think on sex, you should pray. You shouldn't think on sex, you should pray and go to nature and have the good feeling of a sunny, bright day. And Horkheimer, he had this sense to say, no, don't go to the swimming pool, don't listen to too much music, discuss democratic issues, you know, engage yourself in democratic processes, you know. So that was a way of discussing with students. And one of the well-known figures, Helmut Becker, he wrote to Adorno a letter in which he wrote that Horkheimer at that time, in the middle of the 50s, was seen as a pope for left students. You know, he had really authoritarian, yeah. So a big moral influence, much more than Adorno. And people liked Horkheimer because he had this concrete. His courses were very concrete, with a lot of examples on what's going on in Germany. And so that gives people an idea of how critical theory was arguing. And what they did at that time, of course, they had the Institute of Social Research. And what was very often in the literature on critical theory, that's not so really clear, that the Institute of Social Research, after coming back from exile, was a private research institute. Yeah, it had not so much own money, more or less no money. And so they had to apply for grants. Yeah, so, and what they did without money was research on the opinions and attitudes of students. So this was important because I think no professor in German history knew better than they what the attitudes and the opinions of students, have been, or where, So I think this is important because they had a very clear idea about the development of university, because one has to have in mind that in the 20s, 85% of the students have been in favor for the German Empire, also Großdeutschland, anti-Semitic, and I don't know the English word, völkisch. Völkisch is sympathizing with this idea of an Aryan race. And now they saw that these younger students in West Germany, they became more and more democratic. Of course, there was a lot of conservatives or even right-wing students, but this part was shrinking. So in this famous research as a study of by Habermas and Friedeburg, the result was that about 4, 5, 6% was a kind of hardcore right-wing people, authoritarian, and then you have this broader fringe, and then you have a big group of in political terms, uncertain people who are not very well oriented. So it gave them the feeling that there is a good chance to influence students, so to say, in a democratic direction. And for that reason, they had the idea to have in mind the idea to recruit young people for critical theory. And then they always thought, how can we do that? I mean, of course, you can teach, but then what happens with the students when they finished with the university? And what is the knowledge, the form of knowledge about? Is that helpful for becoming progressive and against reification and against consumption and the terror of value form and so on? And so they established this new form of a sociology diploma that didn't exist in Germany until 1955. And they have been the first to do that, and the Institute of Social Research. And that is the important thing, that the institute before was private, just a private research institute. And establishing this new curriculum on sociology and the diploma, then they became recognized by the Hessian government, to being a part of the Frankfurt University. And this is something new, it lasted only for about 15 years, that the Institute of Social Research was an official part, a department of the Frankfurt University. So people who wanted to study sociology, they became students of the Institute of Social Research. This was a funny construction, because though they had to go through this education, so they had this contact with Adorno, Horkheimer, and Friedeburg, and other disciples of, and for a certain time also Habermas, and so it was this kind of curriculum, that brought people in contact and with the critical theory, and you can see that in the increase of the numbers. At the very beginning, it was about 30, 40 students in sociology, and just 5 years later, in the beginning of the 60s, it was more than 600, 700. So it was really a big extension of the institute.
Now let's just talk about this this development of the discipline of sociology, of kind of their kind of creation or the need for sociology as an extension of philosophy. Can you just kind of explain what was their conception of sociology? Why was sociology such an important field for them to develop from the standpoint of philosophy?
Now, first of all, the basic idea was that students, and more so philosophy students, should not draw back into an elitist position. Yeah, that means, you know how philosophers are very often are. You think, okay, you can explain everything with Kant, or you can go back to Hume, or you discuss it with Spinoza or with Hegel, and you don't care about the facts. You don't have no clear sense of how society is organized, how it is polarized between classes and the relation of sexes and so on and so on. And what is about labor? How is labor organized? Yeah, what is happening in the plants? Yeah, and so all this was important for them. Is there still a working class, or what happened to social classes? In which way behave the bourgeois class? And for them, it was really important. When you look at the chapter on cultural industry, then you see that they have this idea that they speak very often from dominant groups, from powerful groups, and how they steer society. And then, of course, they thought, okay, we have to prepare individuals to become strong subjects to resist. So for them, it was a way to teach people not to become sympathizers of right-wing orientations, tendencies. And it was a way to politicize students, yeah, to go this. So, and that means, not following the ideological concept, yeah, as conspiracy or what I wish how the world is, and the world is quite different when you know the facts, So this is, I think, one of the most important things, But I also already mentioned the second one, that for Adorno and Horkheimer, it was very important to give people an idea how to protect, yeah, against the authoritarian desires or the pressures, how you can, when you think on the last thesis in the elements of anti-Semitism, for them it was important not to become a person who thinks or behave only in terms of tickets. Yeah, to reflect your own position in the society, and to think on what you're doing and what your knowledge is for. Yeah. And that is important, yeah, to teach people then an empirical knowledge, to accept that there is a positive reality. You have to understand how it works, what establish this positive world, how it is generated, yeah, by which power structures, yeah, the determining powers, as Horkheimer wrote in the early 30s, yeah. So to understand what the historical background of the social processes are. So people should become familiar with social theory, with history, with different theoretical approaches, yeah, to understand in which position they are and how their own life and the life of others are determined. Yeah. So, and I think, yeah, and let's say, or let's just mention a third point. For them, the experience of the United States and the New Deal was very important, because also with regard to your own research field, because for them, at that time, it became clear that there was so much criticism on planning, yeah, by the neoliberals like Leopold Mises and Hayek and Popper and all the others. But then they figured out that plan was not any longer a critical concept, because also the Nazis, they took over the idea of planning a society. They had these 4 years and 5 years planning processes and organized the military, the way how Germany became a strong military society, So plan played an ambivalent role at that time. And for them, it was an important issue to say that the welfare state, this is quite a different state form compared to the liberal state that was existing until World War I. Yeah, so a different way of organizing state domination and the rule of law and so on, the way of democracy and so on. And so they had the idea that also Germany will take over a welfare state system. And in fact, that happened. And so the idea was to train people, to educate people to become a state part of the state staff informed by state planning, but then not become a technocrat, but to do that in democratic terms. For them, it was clear there will be a welfare state, and the welfare state is more or less a technocratic enterprise. So it's important to bring in non-authoritarian, well-educated, critical people who can do this kind of democratic planning.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested in both how this relates to the work before the war, like the Horkheimer's The Authoritarian State, which seems a bit more radical than this idea of training people for the welfare state. And also if Adorno and Horkheimer here had different kind of practices or politics in the post-war period in relationship to the students and the development of the institution itself.
Yeah, that's a big question. How radical is radical? I mean, for them, that's true. I mean, for them, the idea was how to protect democratic processes. To see that the state can shift so quick into an authoritarian state, give them the idea that it is necessary to immunize, state, as persons who do their work in the state apparatus. I mean, when you think of course, what Trump is doing, when you think on these problems, how quick it works, to dismantle an apparatus or a branch of the apparatus. And then, of course, it's important. Do people resignate? Do they follow? Do they conform? Do they protest? Do they act in a different way to defend democracy and looking for new ways of democratizing society? And for them, I mean, you have to have in mind that they expected many, and in fact, that was the empirical fact, that many of the persons who worked in the state apparatus, the staff, Beamte, the clerks,
civil servants,
many of them have been Nazis. They were not very much convinced by democracy, or they had only this formal understanding of democracy as we still experienced in the 60s, Of course, everybody claimed to be a Democrat, but it was just a very authoritarian way of doing it. We are Democrats, and so it was a kind of an imperative, so that you had no chance to become a part of the process, the will formation process, a decision making process. And so, all these debates then we had in the 70s or since the 70s and 80s on new social movements and participation and deliberation, all this was unknown. I mean, look, my English teacher, he was a volunteer in the SS, and he was a member of killing commandos, And this guy, he was then a deputy of the CDU in the Hessian parliament. And he was really a brutal person, He was always very brutal and authoritarian. But we didn't know, of course, that he was a former SS man, So, but this was, you could have this in everyday life. You had these people all around you, former officers and SI and SS and so on and so on.
Okay. So in this process of like training students or educating students to be immunized from this authoritarian tendencies, a kind of radicalization occurred between the development of sociology, 55 to, let's say, like the mid 60s. You said the numbers of students exploded in this field. And then this kind of came to a head in the late 60s when the student movement, SDS particularly, and students like Duschke in Berlin or Kroll in Frankfurt, students of Adorno as well, sometimes came into conflict with their own teachers. So what happened in the student movement? I mean, I know you have a 100-page chapter on this in your book, but if you could kind of give your version, your account. So what happened in the student movement? Like, was this the students that Adorno and Horkheimer created coming against them? Was there a really big gap between them, like it's told, or is the story more complex?
Yeah, I mean both. I mean, it is. In a way, many of these students in Frankfurt and in Berlin were committed to critical theory, and they saw themselves in the tradition of critical theory, and they expected Adorno and Horkheimer to act more radical, than they in fact did. But Horkheimer was in his 70s, and Adorno in the middle of his 60s, so they had different problems, So Adorno was very clear, it's not my role to go to manifestations on the street. I'm too old. I'm too thick. Also zu embonpoint, sagt he says in French. And so he was concerned with writing, to use the time of finishing some of his books and so. But so, and what he was, so what they expected, or what they were frightened of by the student activities, that the students' activities could enforce technocratic reforms. So it was because the students argued in a way of reorganizing the university in a more efficient way. And so for Adorno, it was important to have this realm of freedom, seminars and with long debates, and what he says in the foreword for the Dialectics of Enlightenment, residuals of liberty, what means there are so many uneven institutions in the university, and he always was skeptical about the reorganization of universities. So he was afraid that the student movement could enforce a technocratic reform. And then also he was skeptical for the fact that they disturbed his courses and seminars. And so he was ironic to these students and said, why don't you go to the others who are really conservatives and reactionary? Why do you come and interrupt my course, yeah, and disturb my lectures, So, and I think he was not so wrong, yeah, that people came and occupied his, courses, yeah, and he was, yeah, he said, why you are so ridiculous, yeah, with your with the way how you protest with this naked woman. So he found it disgusting, yeah, and very petty bourgeois, yeah, that they expected him to be shocked by this, yeah, and he said, what they thinking of me, this is not at all my relationship to these students. It's not so serious, So he was, so in letters to Herbert Marcuse, he sometimes argued they behave like fascists. Yeah, what they do is they hinder me as a left person, as a Marxist, as a Jew, and don't let me teach the things I want to teach for critical purposes, criticizing capitalist societies. And so this is a kind of ambivalent impact on the teachers of critical theories themselves, So is that in a way plausible that they had all these doubts about what is the role of the students? Is the intention of the students in really a left intention, or is there another level of meaning that is reactionary against critical theory? So they were full of doubts about it. Yeah.
I mean, at the same time, on a very practical level, they did maintain kind of relationships with like Kroll or the SDS.
Yeah, sure.
When they're arrested, or so. I mean, there's different levels of interaction between the disruptions of the seminar, but then the solidarity in other realms. And I thought this was a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
No, I found that too. This is really an interesting point that Adorno, he never made a break, he never interrupted the relationships to these students. He always, when you think of his article on social conflict today, he wrote this with Ursel Jährich. Ursel Jährich, she was a well-known person in the socialist student movement, the SDS, and then she became a member of a communist group a little bit later. So, there were close relations. And so he also was in contact with Hans-Jürgen Krahl. And Hans-Jürgen Krahl, he was one of the spokespersons who occupied the Institute of Social Research. So that means the institute that was the private research institute, not the university building of the Institute of Social Research. That's important. So he came to this private institute, and then it was not Adorno. That's what Ludwig von Friedeburg told me, who was when I was a fellow at the Institute of Social Research. The director was Ludwig von Friedeburg, and he told me that he called the police. And it was not because he was in sympathy for the student movement, but this is always a little bit weird, and I don't know how much you can believe, but his argument was it was an insurance problem. To call for the police was necessary for legal reasons, to fulfill the conditions of the insurance, And then the next day, so Krahl came into prison, and was accused for the occupation. And then Adorno the next day, or I don't know, 2 days later, he visited Krahl in prison. So, and though they had this, it wasn't still friendly relationship going on. So it was, in a way, it was a kind of subversive action, so, and everybody understood it, in that way.
Yeah, we're coming up to about an hour here. So before we open up for questions, just maybe some last reflections on the particular relation between theory and practice that Adorno and Horkheimer developed in their conception of critical theory in the post-war period.
Yeah.
So how do you see this particular relation between the two and their reflections on it, both in their writings, but also in this more internal side that you've spoken of in terms of their institutional and their student work?
Yeah, I think the historical circumstances, the conditions of historical developments leaded Adorno to the idea that there is a break, an interruption between theory and practice. For him, the ideal situation was 48 and 1919.
Yeah.
So with the council movement, so this was a very close relationship between theory and practice. In 48, it was the Communist Manifesto, and then the revolution in France, the June uprisal in Paris, and for him that was an important failure of the liberation movement. So that's the reason why he was saying practice failed. So then when practice is failing, then we have to rethink theory. I mean, this is not only Adorno. This is what we say also in face of fascism, that we say, okay, we need to have a theoretical idea of what's going on because we have to understand the process, And so in my eyes, Adorno and Horkheimer had the idea to prepare, and this is a very practical issue, to prepare young people to be able to analyze these developments because for Adorno was clear fascism is not over. Fascism comes not from outside, but from inside democracy. So it will come back again and again and again. So it's necessary to, on a socio-psychological level, to immunize people, on an intellectual, epistemological level, to prepare people to analyze it, to be prepared in a political sense that it will happen again. And so, and I think this is very practical. It's not in the sense practical in immediate terms,
Mm-hmm.
So for him to go to a manifestation was not so very important, but in fact, he was in support for this, At that time in 66, 67, 68, there was an intensively discussed problem of emergency law. So introduced by the conservative government, since the early 60s, an emergency law. And so many left people, intellectuals, were fighting against this, and also the socialist student movement, so SDS was fighting against it. And Adorno was in support, and it was one of the few times when he had a very close relation to the metal workers union, the IG Metall, so the trade unions. And he said, trade unions are so important for us because this is a space where critical theory can develop. And I mean, this is not the image we normally have, when we think on Adorno, but he was, when you see the talks he gave, and the public speeches with these discussions, he very often speaks in very concrete terms, against nuclear weapons, against for trade unions and democratic fights on this really empirical level. And in his courses, I mean, you can't find that in the same explicit way in his articles or books, but when you see in his courses, there are many references to concrete political debates in Germany. Not as much as one could expect, but enough. So it gives a concrete idea that there are different levels. This is what I find important. Different levels of practice. Yeah, the introduction of a new curriculum, a new understanding of sociology, the theoretical praxis of concepts and writings, and also this political practice, yeah, on organizing, management, and so on. Yeah.
Great. Well, on that note, maybe we pause and let any of the guests ask questions. If you have some questions, I suggest writing it in the chats. If you cannot write it in the chat, then you could also, let's see, I could help you unmute. You could also say it, but let's start with the first question. Should I read it? Clara, do you want to read it, or should I read it? I'll read it. So this was the first one from Dogo Una. What was critical theories or critical theorists' relation to anti-imperialist movements in politics?
Yeah.
Important contemporary processes like Vietnam and the Algerian War, or theories of imperialism in general. It is, for example, reported that Horkheimer made statements defending the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
How should we assess critical theories' continued relation to and interest in international totality of capitalism as imperialism or international anti-imperialist politics generally?
Sure. Genau. Yeah, big question. So many disputes took place on this issue. And yes, Horkheimer was critical about the student movement for the criticism of the US intervention. Yeah, so he was in favor for it because his idea was, I mean, he saw it from the background of the US intervention in Europe and against the Nazi regime. And his idea was that that there is a fight for freedom, yeah, done by the US Army. And so, yeah, in my eyes, it was wrong. And for us as, yeah, with this critical theory background, we were very critical about it. And at what we learned then, when we had the chance to read his notices he wrote in the 50s and 60s, you know, then we figured out that it was not only the last word Horkheimer said to these problems. He was so critical about the export practices of German government. Yeah, so he was so critical about the support of the Iranian Persian Shah. Yeah, so he had all this kind of criticism. So I find Horkheimer as an ambivalent figure. So I have no sympathy with that, to say it in that terms, but yeah, I think there's this, he has his own ambivalent approach to this. And thinking on Adorno, I mean, Adorno was more critical with regard to the Vietnam War, but he was also, I mean, discussing this problem. For us, I mean, it was really a challenge, yeah. I mean, we all admired Che Guevara at that time, of course, you know, and the Cuban Revolution and so on. And he was so critical about Che Guevara, yeah, and he said, what doesn't work in the jungle, yeah, of Bolivia, why should it work in Germany and in Berlin? So it was a kind of a critique of Tupamaros, that means the urban guerrilla. So he was very critical on this. And I think this is something that you have this different approaches and estimates of what is good for a left. And when you think, okay, these dogmatic traditions and people organized in Maoist groups, yeah, and the problematic outcome, yeah, though older Marxists at that time, many of them have been very critical and distanciated to these new forms of organizing. Yeah. but I have no reason to defend it. I mean, I myself found it always a little bit ridiculous. Yeah.
Any follow-ups to that question or any other questions? Okay, we have a question here from Momia. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Somehow I couldn't send a message in the chat. Is it okay like this?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would say like that the phrase, as the mentioned phrase, political potential of critical theory should not be separated from its philosophical potential.
Yeah.
In concrete, I will just read it shortly, it's easier. So otherwise, we would have to deal with the over-evaluation of the institutional position of the critical intellectuals. It could evoke a Platonist sentiment about the necessity of the dominance of the philosophers in the public realm, which results in a problematic glorification of the notion of the dominance. This kind of arche-based approach leads to the mode of the politicization in which beginning presents the theoretical activity of critical intellectuals and command in governings refers to the mechanism of their influence on the civil societies, in this case students and so on. A kind of solution for this shortage would be a perspective shift from the political, practical prefix of critical theory to the political philosophy of critical theory, in a sense of determining the nature of the relationship between these two. For example, what some French intellectuals did, like Miguel Abençoor and so on. Could you maybe comment it? Like that.
I didn't get it all. I mean, yeah. So only a part. So please make it short.
For example, you also mentioned today that Frankfurter, when they came back to Germany and so on, that they also wanted to be more related to the praxis. They conducted some inquiries and so on. But somehow it's also a bit contradictory, like because their role is the role of philosophers. They are like people who were in some sort of kingdom of ideas in that sense. Even in the United States, having in mind they didn't have also some kind of institutional affiliations and so on. Yeah. So my point is that that's also a bit problematic because it refers always to sort of to the notion of the dominance in that Platonic sense. If you approach the civil society and everything from that dominant position.
Yeah.
So yeah, in my opinion, like maybe it's also with something about the title, Politics of Critical Theory. It's rather political philosophy of critical theory, because in political philosophy, which is a poetic construct, both of the domains are expressed with this term, like also politics, very practical thing, and philosophy as two modes of existence in general. So you can, to ask if you can commend it, and if you in your book maybe somehow reflect also the pure philosophical perspective.
I mean, this is an interesting aspect, that political philosophy didn't play a role in the 50s and 60s. There was not an important role of the concept of political philosophy. That is something that is more discussed then later in the 70s and 80s, more so in the 80s and 90s and so on. So today this has this kind of self-evidence to speak on political philosophy. For Horkheimer, I think when he speaks on this issue, that his idea was that he spoke about philosophy, yeah. So, and for him, the idea was very similar to what Gramsci was thinking on that philosophy can materialize in institutional practices. So there is a lot of criticism on Horkheimer because he didn't wrote so much, and many of the things he published under his name are more or less written by Adorno. But Horkheimer's philosophy, you could say, is materialized in the institutional practices. That means the Institute of Social Research after coming back from exile, the way how he shaped and organized or contributed to organize philosophy and the university in Frankfurt and the student house. I spoke about that. And the way how he tried to organize exchanges of German students with the US and Israel. So he had a whole bunch of ideas, you know, how critical theory can have a material turn, yeah, not in terms of writing another article or a public discussion, but and also how to organize the way how people know things. Yeah, so this is what I mean by form of knowledge. So the problem of political epistemology, and and I think this is this is what and the problem of dominance. I think they had not a clear, in my eyes, they had not a clear idea of how to say a field of conflicts. They very often speak of Kraftfeld, so a field of power relations, but it's not the analyses they did was not. They do not give you an idea of what's going on in this field. When you see what I think what is really an important text, the cultural industry text, they speak very often from these persons who are in power, very powerful, but it's not an investigation on what are the power relations between the owners of cultural industry, let's say Disney, and what is about the directors and the actors and what's Drehbuchschreiber, screenwriters,
Yeah.
So it's no relation and no analysis on that. And what in my eyes really surprising, because Adorno and Horkheimer knew these people. When you read the letters, Adorno to his parents, you can see he was so familiar with so many of these people, and he had a very good insight on all these little daily conflicts, of famous directors like Fritz Lang and actors, and so on. And so it was so funny, that in the theory, it doesn't play a role. It's only this one part of dominant and powerful persons steering the whole process, and this is not at all clear, and this is really a difficult heritage of critical theory, the relation of structure and action, that they speak, of course, of alienation and reification and fetish and so on. And in this chapter, they speak a lot on the people in power who own the corporations, who steer them, who earn the money, who exploit people. And so this is, I think, so, I don't know, maybe I missed the point, but Adorno and Horkheimer, I think they had some influence, but I wouldn't speak of dominance or domination in intellectual scientific fields as sociology or philosophy. In philosophy, they were really weak. They had some influence in sociology, but they had to fight for it for years and years, because the former Nazi sociologists, they were so strong until the middle of the 60s. It was really a heavy work to do, to limit their influence. And when you read the Positivismus-Streit, I don't know the English translation.
The positivism dispute.
Yeah, positivism dispute. Then this is a way it was a way how they conducted this struggle. Yeah, it was not about methods and positivism. Yeah, it was what is it? A scapegoat? Yeah, is that
Scapegoat?
Scapegoat? Yeah, it's the other way around. So that they discuss methods, but in fact, the discussion was about who gets the research money from the German research fund. Yeah, it was, and who is able to conduct this kind or that kind of research. And then you had still racists. I mean, this racists in a very traditional sense, measuring the head size, looking for IQs and so on. Yeah, so it was really terrible, at that time,
I'm going to go through some other questions in the chat. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. So this one is very similar. You might have answered it already. Thank you for your interesting talk. This is from Max Urbich. I was wondering about the specific role of politics in Adorno's theory. It's often said that the Frankfurt School lacks a concrete approach to analyzing political structures. Do you think that's the case, or would you argue that critical theory does provide an adequate framework for engaging with political institutions and structures?
Yeah. Okay. Adorno was very critical about the concept of the political. He didn't like the idea of the political, because for him, the political was something that has to do with domination. That means will formation separated from the everyday life of people. So his argument was, in a way, how to say it, in a way, a traditional Marxian criticism of the political, the separation of the state and society, the separation of state and economy. And for him, the implication of this separation was that people, the everyday persons, are not part of the processes. So for him, the relevant example was the council movement. And the council movement is critical about a separated political sphere. So the basic idea was to reintroduce the sphere of the political will formation process back into society. And there is an interesting letter exchange in the late 50s when Adorno thought on inviting one of the famous, well-known Marxist professors, Wolfgang Abendroth from Marburg, to give a talk on democracy in Germany. And so he was really, Wolfgang Abendroth was a big figure. He was in the resistance movement against the Nazis, so very left social democrat. He had an own interpretation of the German constitution, really a well-known and big figure and very respectable. And Adorno, he wrote this letter to Horkheimer, invited him. He is a little bit boring, and he's so uncritical with regard to the concept of the political. For us, the political is just only the surface of social relations and power relations. And of course, we should get rid of it. We should have a social development in which the political becomes unnecessary. So is that superfluous? So we overcome it. So, and that's the reason why the idea to be against political philosophy is, I think, part of the whole approach. And so introduced then at the 70s and 80s, and partly against some dimensions of the older critical theory.
Okay, a couple more questions to see if we can do it. You still have energy, Alex?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay, this is from Adrian Wilding. Nice to see you, Adrian. A fascinating talk. Thank you so much. I get the impression that Horkheimer was a bit of a diplomat once the school returned to Germany, trying to preserve the institute in what he saw as a hostile environment, sometimes toning down the more radical language rather than, as Adorno seems to have tried, to continue its radical project as faithfully as possible. If that's correct, does Horkheimer's diplomacy reflect his perhaps more pessimistic assessment of the political situation than Adorno's? Horkheimer, after all, was always inspired by Schopenhauer, and Adorno always held on to more of Hegel.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, Horkheimer was a little bit more pessimistic. Yeah, and that's the reason why he built the house in Switzerland. Yeah, to have a kind of a shelter to go there in case of a crisis. So he commuted between Switzerland and Frankfurt. And yeah, but and he didn't, I mean, this is like Adorno, he didn't see the subject who is able to do all this. But Adorno, I mean, they had these debates, you know, they disputed this problem. And Horkheimer, he was himself critical on Adorno's optimism is maybe too strong, but Horkheimer thought, yeah, Adorno believed in negative dialectics. That means, yeah, the strength of criticism that comes from inside will lead people to overcome social relations. Yeah, so, and Horkheimer, he wasn't sure. Yeah, he thought it's necessary to keep the traditional experiences. So he didn't become religious again, but for him it was helpful to refer to religious attitudes, the concepts of religions, because they help to understand what people have been thinking about. Yeah, and so yeah, I think it's right. He's a little bit more pessimistic, but he didn't become a conservative or religious again, but he was, yeah, and then he saw that the problem we have to deal today with, yeah, from a Schopenhauerian perspective, what is about extractivism, the destruction of nature, how we can reconcile with animals and plants. So for him, it was the way how we exploit nature was in a way very terrible. So there is a continuity in his work, I think, since the 20s, you know. So, and yeah, so the idea of, can we really solve the problem of domination of nature? And is that possible? And I think he saw that very pessimistic. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And this is a question we are concerned with today, isn't it? I mean, there are so many tipping points we have to deal with. Yeah, in the climate crisis, the biodiversity, the mass massacre, and so on and so on. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to talk to you about Horkheimer's book, Dämmerung, one day, which is a very pessimistic collection of aphorisms, but also very communist and Marxist.
Yeah.
But let me go to the next question from James Crane.
Sure.
Thanks for coming, James. Thank you for the presentation. This has really challenged the way I think about post-1950s critical theory as a project, particularly as far as institutional politics play a central role for them. I was wondering whether you think the institutional dynamic Adorno and Horkheimer initiated after they returned is still operative in Germany, in the German educational system today, and whether you think their radical pedagogical project has yet to be fulfilled. What would a continuation of their post-war institutional practice and theory look like today? Do you think this would consist more in educational reform or in the creation of new kinds of institutions?
Ooh, that's a very broad question. Yeah, they were successful. They had a lot of disciples in the different fields, yeah, of pedagogy and schools. And so there were so many people using the concepts of critical theory. And I think it plays a role today. But at the same time, we experience, this is not the mainstream policy, yeah. They play a role, but yeah, there is of course a mainstream pedagogic, yeah, and then also an offensive against it. There was so much criticism from the conservative side against an education reform, the education reorganization of universities. And I think what we're experiencing now in Germany, maybe a little bit on a lower level, but what we're experiencing more in the US, there is really an attack on, how to say, I think that way. When you see what Trump is doing, I think this is point for point a criticism of what Marcuse was discussing. Marcuse is the theoretician of wokeness, yeah, in that term, gender, race, capitalism, everyday behavior, the way how we consume, the way how we approach nature, and so on and so on. And you could say, okay, every of these points are under attack. Yeah, there is a strong offensive. For years and decades, yeah, critical theory played a role to pay attention to democratic education. And during, I think, maybe 10 years or a little bit more, there is a limitation of democratic education in schools, in state funding of democratic education. And for that reason, I think this is one of the explanations why the neo-fascist groups are becoming stronger and stronger, because they have more space, less resistance among young people, because these young people are not very well educated. The knowledge is very little on the way how the Nazi dictatorship was, how it was organized, what the consequences are. And so, yeah, so that's my impression. Maybe the answer is too small, but it would take a long time to go through all these arguments, problems.
Yeah, the German educational system is a long discussion.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Especially what's happening with the cuts right now. This is from maybe two more, and then maybe we stop after that. From Anna Nutini. Thank you very much for this reconstruction. I would like to ask if it is possible to say anything about Adorno and Horkheimer's relationship with Walter Benjamin's legacy, whether you think this relationship sheds light on any aspects of their political role, whether there were different phases in the management of this legacy or differences between the two. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, there was, of course, a debate, a dispute, a criticism of Adorno's relation to Benjamin. There was a suspicion in the 60s that Adorno would hinder the publication of Benjamin's writings. Yeah, it was a suspicion also uttered by Hannah Arendt. And then, of course, I think that was not true. And then one of the disciples of Adorno, Rolf Tiedemann, he then published the writings, the collected works of Walter Benjamin. And so there was an important appreciation of Benjamin's work, I think, and more so for Adorno than for Horkheimer. And yes, and the idea of I mean, the approach of Benjamin, to discuss problems in the perspective of the commodity form, this basic intuition that the commodity form is something very important for our everyday life. I think that is a big influence of Walter Benjamin, and then the approaching these little things to decipher social relations by looking on very little phenomena. This is, I think, also important. I mean, this is not only Walter Benjamin, this is also Krakauer and leads back to Freud and Georg Simmel. But I think it confirms a certain attitude, a certain approach, that Adorno exercised, for long and he always emphasized. And I think he then emphasized it with the work of Benjamin. And then I think, the idea of I mean, in my eyes, Adorno is always a theoretician of the division of manual and intellectual work. And that means all the concepts we are discussing and we are moving in, the philosophical concepts, the sociological concepts, all these play a role in domination because they all are part of bourgeois barbarism. And when you think of one of the important theses in Benjamin's last text on the thesis on philosophy of history, this is exactly his argument, that he says on the wagon, is that, also on the
wagon?
Wagon, this is full of things that the ruling people, they conquered, by the other people, the classes, So it's a kind of a triumph of the bourgeois class to appropriate all the concepts or the cultural processes and claiming that is their own production. So, and I think this is exactly what Adorno then took up by Walter Benjamin, that he proposes or was suggesting that, the culture, all the forms of intellectual work are part of domination, it's part of the triumph. And then, of course, how can we overcome this separation of manual and intellectual work? And this is really a challenge for intellectuals because they have to do all this kind of self-criticism. And this goes further than Walter Benjamin did. It was not the idea of Benjamin. This is something that Adorno developed, but was, stützen, Benjamin, this text of Walter Benjamin was so important for Adorno, So in many aspects, respects,
Okay, let's do one more question from Yuri Kasun. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. There's been a debate about the role of critical theory when it comes to parliamentary party politics. After prominent heads of critical theory in Germany, including you, embraced Die Linke at the last elections. Can you shed some light on what early critical theory can offer us today for day-to-day party politics today? Does critical theory demand these kinds of embracings? I think he's referring to this. There was an article in maybe Philosophy magazine about critical theory and Die Linke.
Sure. I mean, let just for a moment come back to the 50s. For them, it was so important they came back to Germany and then they were asked to help the public administration with their idea of authoritarian personality to select the personnel of the state apparatus. So they were really in a strange situation that they recommended, they checked all the applications, and then they checked who is a former Nazi, who is an authoritarian person. So they developed these questionnaires to find out, is that person, does it fit in a democratic administration, in a, in an intelligence service? That was the issue, Is it possible to have these people in an intelligence service, in the military? So they played a certain role, For them, it was Adorno and Horkheimer have not actively recommended, were not actively participating in these processes, but some of the staff members of the institute, they were then sent to these processes to be part of these processes. And at the same time, they discuss, and you can read this in one of the Horkheimer posthumous volumes with posthumous discussions. Then they discuss a problem of party. We need a party, and so a strong party of the left, and Adorno, he had the plan to criticize the Godesberger program of the Social Democrats. So he was in a way, concerned by these developments. Is there a party? And is a party helpful for critical theory to translate theoretical debates into political practice? So I found that interesting that when we had this, when we made this Aufruf, what is Aufruf in English?
Call.
A call, When we made this call, then the Philomag, there was a guy who wrote an article on it, and that's something new. And in my eyes, it is not new. They have been concerned with this problem in the 50s and in the 60s. So what I already mentioned. And so, and I don't know. The left party is maybe not the best. I have a lot of criticism. But it's helpful to give support to some claims, social claims. So wages, rent control, trade union support, and so social security. So this is, in my eyes, helpful. And I was happy that so many people supported it, because it was so strange to have not a left opposition in the parliament. And I'm not sure if that is stable enough for 4 years. Who knows? It's not the time now to speak on my disappointments of the role of the left party during the last years, but I hope that they will fulfill some of that we can expect by such a more or less reformist left party.
Just one last comment. You mentioned the SPD Godesberg program. I remember that there is a document where Adorno talks about he wants to write a critique of this SPD party platform, and people don't know this was the platform in the 50s, in which the SPD abandoned their kind of socialist background, right, and it became a more pragmatic party of this. And Adorno was thinking about commenting on it, discussing like actual party politics, and then he decided not to, is from what I understand. Or did he? I don't really know what happened at this point.
No, he didn't write it. He was invited by Hans Magnus Enzensberger, who was one of the famous poets at that time and a disciple of Adorno. So he was close to Adorno, and he invited Adorno to write this piece. It was not an intrinsic idea of Adorno to do that, but he had sympathies, to do this kind of criticism. but I think then he didn't find the time to do it. So I can't remember that there is an explicit decision not to do it. I think he wrote to Horkheimer, okay, I think on that. Hans Magnus Enzberger asked me and invited me to do that for this new periodical, the Kursbuch, what was an influential publication for the New Left in Germany in the 60s, and Enzensberger was one of the editors, at that time. And I think Enzensberger invited Adorno to contribute to this Kursbuch, and and then Adorno hadn't the time and didn't. But maybe it was not his first preference to do it. I mean, because then you could think, okay, what does it mean not to have the time? I think it was not his first preference. For him as a director of the institute, it was also a little bit dangerous to write a criticism, because they were depending on public funding, and the government in Hesse, who paid a lot, and the city of Frankfurt, who paid a lot for the institute, both have been governed by the Social Democratic Party. And the Social Democratic Party in this area, also Hesse and Frankfurt, was very much on the left. So always we have to have in mind that some people from the anti-Nazi resistance, Hermann Prill, for example, who was in the concentration camp and tortured, he was one of the big figures in the Ministry of Science, in the 50s and early 60s. And so maybe Adorno then hesitated, because that could be in a way misleading, could enforce a misunderstanding. And because at that time, Fritz Bauer, who was also a social democrat, started the Auschwitz trials. And so that played a big role, and he was so much attacked by conservatives. And then it came out that he is a gay person. And so he was so much under attack. And then criticizing social democracy at that time would weaken it. When someone who was at that time already famous would criticize the Social Democrats, nobody could exactly prognose what the outcome will be.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much, Alex, for taking the time to discuss with us. I want to thank Clara Weinman, too, also a fellow at the center, for helping with the technical questions. Do you want to leave us with any final notes, Alex, before we head off?
Final notes?
Yeah,
I don't know.
No, okay.
Be critical. Don't conform.
Don't conform. I want to I could recommend everyone to pick up this this book when it comes out in English. There's a lot more in there from what we even discussed, and also your memoir. And if there's a series of essays that you've written in English over the last decades on ecology, on politics, on the state, on critical theory, and hopefully that'll be put together in the future. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming and for taking the time.
Thank you, Jacob, again, for your time and making this possible. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
All right, me too. Okay, next time, part two, after Adorno and Horkheimer, Habermas in the future.
Right. This is what we missed today.
What happened after.
Right.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. Ciao.